Imagine discovering that everything your family believed about its origins was only part of the story. For generations, your grandparents proudly said, "We're Scottish." Others insisted, "Our family came from Ireland." The story was repeated around dinner tables, written inside family Bibles, and passed from one generation to the next without question. But then, a faded church register is discovered. A forgotten passenger list surfaces, a centuries-old land record appears, a DNA test connects distant cousins living thousands of miles apart, and suddenly, the story changes, not because your family was wrong, but because history is rarely as simple as the stories we inherit. If your surname is Campbell, Armstrong, Graham, Buchanan, McCoy, Stewart, or one of the 15 names we'll uncover today, your ancestors may have traveled one of the most extraordinary journeys in the English-speaking world. A journey that crossed ancient Celtic kingdoms, survived Roman Britain, endured Viking raids, rode with the feared Border Reivers, settled the troubled lands of Ulster, crossed a dangerous Atlantic, and finally carved new lives from the rugged mountains of Appalachia. But perhaps the greatest surprise of all is that many families who proudly identify today as Scottish or Irish are descendants of people whose roots stretch across nearly every chapter of British history. Ancient Britons, Gaels, Lowland Scots, border families, Northern English settlers, Norse Vikings, and countless ordinary men and women whose names have been forgotten, but whose bloodlines quietly continued. This is not a story about proving one identity over another. It is the story of how identities were created. And by the end of this documentary, you may never look at your own surname the same way again. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten family histories, ancient DNA discoveries, and the remarkable migrations that shaped millions of lives, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to UK Bloodlines, and turn on notifications. Every week, we follow the hidden paths that connect modern families to the distant past. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the year is 1718. The wind howls across the deck of a crowded wooden ship leaving Belfast. A young husband grips the rail as Ireland slowly disappears into the mist. His wife wraps a blanket around their sleeping daughter. Everything they own fits inside two weathered wooden chests: an axe, a family Bible, a few iron cooking pots, seeds carefully wrapped in cloth, and a surname. A name their children will carry into a world they cannot yet imagine. They do not know that one day their descendants will build cabins deep inside the Appalachian Mountains. They do not know that centuries later, their great-great-great-grandchildren will search for them using genealogy websites and DNA testing kits. They only know one thing: there is no turning back. That family never existed exactly as you see them, but thousands of families live stories remarkably similar to theirs. Throughout this documentary, they will guide us through one of history's greatest migrations, because sometimes following one family helps us understand millions. Yet their journey did not begin in Belfast, not even close. To understand these Appalachian surnames, we must travel back far beyond ships and colonies, far beyond Scotland, far beyond Ireland, more than 2,000 years into the past. Imagine standing upon a windswept hill somewhere in ancient Britain. Below you stretch forests, untouched by roads. Smoke rises from scattered roundhouses. Farmers guide cattle through narrow tracks. Warriors painted with blue pigments stand watch from towering hill forts overlooking fertile valleys. These are the ancient Celtic peoples of Britain, communities that spoke languages very different from modern English, communities divided into powerful tribal kingdoms: the Brigantes, the Iceni, the Silures, the Ordovices, the Catuvillani, names almost forgotten today, yet their descendants never truly disappeared. Then, the horizon changes. Roman standards appear, legions march across the countryside, engineers begin building roads straighter than anything Britain had ever seen, stone forts rise beside rivers, bathhouses steam with warm water carried through remarkable aqueducts. Merchants arrive from Gaul, soldiers from Spain, officials from Italy, craftsmen from North Africa. Britain becomes part of one of history's greatest empires. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain connected the island to an immense world stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle East. Yet Rome did not erase Britain, it transformed it. Local families adopted Roman customs while preserving older traditions. Children grew up speaking more than one language. Neighbors married across cultural boundaries. The story of Britain became one of adaptation rather than replacement. Modern archaeology and ancient DNA are revealing that these communities became far more intertwined than historians once believed. That matters, because many people imagine ancestry as something fixed, one people replacing another, one nation beginning where another ends. History tells a different story. It tells the story of layers. Every generation inherited something from those before it. Every generation added something new, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the British Isles. When Roman authority finally collapsed during the 5th century, uncertainty swept across Britain. Kingdoms fragmented, trade declined, old political structures weakened. Across the North Sea, new migrants began arriving: Angles, Saxons, Jutes. For generations, schoolbooks taught that these newcomers simply replaced the native population. Modern evidence paints a richer picture. Migration was real, substantial in some regions, smaller in others, but the people already living in Britain did not simply vanish. Communities mixed, families intermarried, languages changed, identities evolved. The ancestors of many later Scottish, English, and Irish families were already becoming part of this remarkable tapestry centuries before surnames even existed. Then came another wave of change. Across the Irish Sea, Gaelic-speaking settlers established the kingdom of Dalriata, linking western Scotland and northeastern Ireland so closely that people crossed the narrow waters almost as easily as later generations would cross county boundaries. Meanwhile, farther north, the mysterious Picts continued ruling much of Scotland. Eventually these worlds merged, not through one dramatic event, but through generations of alliances, marriages, conflict, and cooperation. History rarely changes overnight. It changes one family at a time, one marriage at a time, one generation at a time. And then, longships appeared on the horizon. The Vikings had arrived. Most people picture them only as raiders. Some certainly were, but many stayed. They traded, farmed, married local families, founded towns, raised children, left behind words still spoken today, and quietly became ancestors of countless people who would never call themselves Vikings. The deeper we look into history, the more we discover that Britain's story has never belonged to one people alone. It belongs to everyone who became part of it. But none of these ancient migrations fully explain why certain surnames became so deeply rooted in Appalachia. For that, we must ride into one of the most dangerous frontiers medieval Europe had ever known, a place where a man's surname could determine whether he lived or died, the Scottish border. And that is where our real story begins. The year is 1597. A cold mist hangs over the rolling hills where Scotland meets England. Before the sun has even reached the horizon, a lone horseman races silently across the moor. His horse knows the route by heart. His cloak is soaked with dew. His sword hangs loosely at his side. Behind him, another dozen riders emerge from the fog. They are not soldiers, not exactly, nor are they ordinary farmers. They are Border Reivers. For nearly 3 centuries, these men and their families lived in one of the most dangerous frontiers in Europe. Here, the authority of kings often meant very little. Law traveled slowly. Justice was uncertain. Survival depended on something far stronger than government. Your family, your surname, your clan. If your neighbor's cattle disappeared during the night, suspicion rarely fell upon strangers. It fell upon another border family. One raid led to revenge. Revenge led to another feud. And some feuds lasted for generations. Children were born into conflicts they had never started. Grandfathers died defending lands their ancestors had fought over for centuries. This brutal world shaped many of the surnames still found throughout Appalachia today. But before we reveal the first names on our list, meet our traveling family once again. Imagine the young couple we left standing on the deck of that ship leaving Belfast. Now imagine their story centuries earlier. Their ancestors are no longer staring across the Atlantic. Instead, they are standing outside a stone tower house somewhere near the Anglo-Scottish border. Night has fallen. Inside, a mother whispers prayers over sleeping children. Outside, every barking dog sends men reaching for their weapons. No one knows whether tonight will bring peace or another raid. This family never existed exactly as we are imagining them. But thousands of real families lived lives astonishingly similar to this one. Their world produced toughness that would later prove invaluable on another frontier half a world away. And it is here that our first surname appears, Armstrong. Few names capture the spirit of the Border Reivers more completely. According to later tradition, the family earned its name after a warrior used the strength of his arm to rescue a Scottish king during battle. Whether legend or fact, historians agree on something even more remarkable. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Armstrongs had become one of the most powerful riding families along the western border. Government officials repeatedly complained about them. Royal armies struggled to control them. Records describe Armstrong horsemen moving swiftly through valleys under cover of darkness, recovering stolen cattle, defending relatives, or launching retaliatory raids against rival families. To the English crown, they were dangerous. To Scotland's kings, often equally troublesome. But to fellow Armstrongs, they were simply family. Modern descendants often imagine the surname as purely Scottish. That is understandable. Yet many Armstrong families later settled in Ulster before crossing the Atlantic. Others married into neighboring border families, whose own histories stretched across Scotland, northern England, and Ireland. Their story became larger than one country, and perhaps that is the greatest surprise. If your surname is Armstrong, your ancestry may preserve the memory of one of Europe's most extraordinary frontier societies. Not merely Scotland, but the border itself. And that remarkable frontier spirit would travel all the way to Appalachia. Yet another surname became almost as famous, one whose origins still spark debate among historians today, Graham. Unlike Armstrong, whose border identity is unmistakable, the earliest roots of Graham remain less certain. Some scholars point toward Norman connections after 1066. Others argue for earlier British origins. Whatever the beginning, one fact is beyond dispute. The Grahams became one of the great border families. For generations, they lived in exactly the same dangerous landscape. Horsemen, landowners, warriors, negotiators, sometimes protectors, sometimes raiders, always survivors. Imagine riding beside them before dawn, hooves barely making a sound across wet grass. Every distant light could belong to a friend or an enemy. Every hill concealed uncertainty. That constant instability shaped generations of Graham families, long before they ever considered America. Later, many Grahams settled in Ulster, still later. Their descendants sailed for Pennsylvania, then followed the Great Wagon Road south into the Appalachian frontier. Different century, different continent, remarkably similar life. Once again, a frontier family adapting to another frontier. The next surname may surprise even more people, because many Americans immediately associate it with Scotland's beautiful Highlands. Yet its journey into Appalachia tells a much larger story. Campbell. Few surnames are more recognizable. The Campbells became one of Scotland's most influential Highland kindreds, powerful chiefs, large estates, political influence reaching the highest levels of the kingdom. Their history includes remarkable achievement, but also fierce rivalries that still echo through Scottish folklore. Ask almost anyone about Clan Campbell, and they will probably mention Highland castles, tartan, bagpipes, perhaps even Glencoe. Yet countless Campbell descendants never remained in the Highlands. Economic pressures encouraged movement into the lowlands. Others entered Ulster, many later crossed the Atlantic. By the 18th century, Campbell families could already be found scattered across colonial America. Some became ministers, others blacksmiths, farmers, teachers, militia officers, frontier pioneers. The surname survived because the family kept moving, always adapting, always beginning again. And that may be the hidden lesson behind the Campbell story. Sometimes the strongest families are not those who remain in one place, but those who learn how to thrive wherever history carries them. Then comes another name whose story feels quieter, yet is no less remarkable. Buchanan. Stand beside the peaceful waters of Loch Lomond. The morning mist rises gently across the lake. Green hills surround ancient lands where Buchanan families established themselves centuries ago. Compared with the violence of the borders, this world appears almost tranquil. Yet history would soon pull Buchanan families into the same great currents affecting all of Scotland. Political upheaval, economic hardship, religious change, migration. Like countless neighboring families, many Buchanans eventually looked westward. Some crossed into Ulster, others sailed directly for America. Every branch followed a slightly different path. That is why genealogy matters. Two people sharing the Buchanan surname today may discover remarkably different family journeys. One line may have remained closely connected with Highland Scotland. Another may have spent generations in Ulster before ever reaching North America. A third may include marriages linking Scottish, Irish, Border, and English communities together. The surname opens the door, the records tell the story, and modern DNA often reveals just how unexpectedly connected those stories really are. Already, 4 names have appeared: Armstrong, Graham, Campbell, Buchanan. 4 surnames, 4 different journeys. One remarkable pattern: none traveled to Appalachia by accident. Each carried centuries of history long before reaching the mountains of America. But the greatest transformation was still ahead, because even the toughest border families eventually faced something they could not fight with horses or swords: a king's decision, one political plan, one vast settlement project, a project that would reshape the future of Britain, and ultimately create the people America would come to know as the Scots-Irish. That turning point was called the Plantation of Ulster, and without it, Appalachian history would have looked completely different. The year is 1610. The border has grown quieter. The endless cattle raids that once terrified entire valleys are beginning to fade. For generations, families like the Armstrongs, Grahams, and many others had lived by instincts sharpened through centuries of uncertainty. They knew every hill, every stream, every hidden track that crossed the Anglo-Scottish frontier. But now, the frontier itself was changing. The crowns of England and Scotland had been united under one monarch, and King James VI of Scotland, who also became James III of England, had little patience for the old border way of life. The Reivers, who had once been useful in defending the frontier, suddenly became a problem to be solved. Tower houses were abandoned, weapons were confiscated, some powerful families were executed, others were imprisoned. Many simply left. For the first time in generations, thousands of frontier families found themselves searching for somewhere new to build a future. And across the Irish Sea, opportunity was waiting, or at least that was how it appeared. Imagine our young border family once more. The grandfather who once rode through the mist now watches his sons preparing to leave. Their horses are gone, their weapons have been surrendered. Instead of sharpening swords, they are loading wagons. Instead of preparing for another raid, they are preparing for another beginning. The destination is Ulster. They have never seen it. They know only what others have told them. Good farmland, fresh opportunities, a chance to start again. As their wagon disappears over the horizon, they cannot possibly imagine that this single journey will eventually lead their descendants to the Appalachian Mountains. History often changes through decisions that seem ordinary at the time. The Plantation of Ulster became one of those moments. Beginning in the early 17th century, thousands of Protestant settlers from lowland Scotland, the Borders, and northern England moved into Northern Ireland. Some came willingly in search of land. Others were encouraged by government policy. Many hoped simply to leave years of instability behind. For the native Irish population, however, the plantation brought profound disruption. Communities that had existed for centuries suddenly found themselves living alongside newcomers with different religious traditions, political loyalties, and cultural backgrounds. Conflict certainly followed, but conflict was not the entire story. Markets still operated, neighboring farms still traded, children still played together, families occasionally married across community lines. Life has a way of becoming more complicated than politics. Over the following generations, something remarkable happened. A new identity slowly emerged. These people were not entirely Scottish, nor were they entirely Irish. They had Scottish ancestors. Many had lived in Ireland for generations. Their children were born there. Their customs slowly evolved. Their accents changed. Their identities became something unique. Centuries later, America would know them by a new name, the Scots-Irish. That name would become almost inseparable from Appalachia. But before America could shape them, Ulster shaped them first. Our traveling family is still with us. Their children are now growing up in County Antrim. And the oldest son speaks with an accent slightly different from his father. His closest friend comes from another Scottish family that arrived years earlier. The blacksmith in the next village has Irish relatives. The local market brings together people from many backgrounds. Without realizing it, an entirely new generation is being created, one that belongs completely to Ulster. And yet, history has another surprise waiting. By the early 18th century, life in Ulster began growing increasingly difficult. Population expanded rapidly. Good farmland became harder to obtain. Rents continued rising. Economic opportunities narrowed. Religious disagreements created additional pressures. Many families reached the same conclusion. It was time to leave again. This time, they would cross an ocean. Imagine standing on the docks at Belfast around the year 1725. Rain falls gently across wooden ships, preparing for departure. Children clutch small bundles of clothing. Women hold tightly to family Bibles, wrapped carefully against the weather. Men make one final glance toward the shoreline. Some will never see Ireland again. Nobody cheers, nobody celebrates. Because leaving home is rarely joyful, it is hopeful. But hope often comes wrapped in uncertainty. Our traveling family boards alongside hundreds of others. Among them are Campbells, Armstrongs, Grahams, Buchanans, Stewarts, Fergusons, Maxwells, families whose descendants will one day populate the valleys of Appalachia. The Atlantic crossing is long. Storms batter the ships. Food becomes scarce. Disease occasionally spreads among crowded passengers. For many families, the voyage itself becomes the greatest challenge they have ever faced. Weeks later, land appears, Pennsylvania. At first glance, everything feels unfamiliar. The forests seem endless, the rivers wider, the distances impossible. Yet these settlers recognize something beneath the surface. Opportunity. Many remain near Philadelphia. Others quickly realize that the best land is already becoming expensive. Once again, the frontier calls. And so begins one of the greatest overland migrations in American history. The Great Wagon Road. Thousands of wagons begin moving south through the Shenandoah Valley. Families walk beside oxen for months. Children sleep beneath canvas. Entire communities travel together. Churches relocate together. Neighbors remain neighbors. They are not simply moving. They are transplanting entire ways of life. Our traveling family walks that road too. The grandfather who once crossed from Scotland into Ulster has now become an old man. His grandson has never seen Scotland. His great-grandson has never seen Ireland. Yet all three generations are making the same journey, toward another frontier, toward another beginning. This is perhaps the greatest irony in the entire Scots-Irish story. Generation after generation kept leaving frontiers, only to settle new ones. By the time these families reached western Virginia, eastern Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and the mountain valleys beyond, they discovered landscapes strangely familiar. Steep hills, dense forests, fast rivers, scattered settlements, isolation, hard work, self-reliance. It reminded many of the worlds their ancestors had already known: the Border, the Highlands, Ulster. Appalachia became the newest chapter, not because it resembled Britain exactly, but because frontier people often recognize another frontier when they see one. Now, the next surname on our list may be the most famous of them all, a name recognized around the world because of one legendary family feud. But that feud almost overshadows an even greater story, because centuries before they ever faced the Hatfields, the McCoys had already crossed kingdoms, crossed seas, crossed an ocean, and crossed history itself. Imagine standing on the banks of the Tug Fork River in the late 19th century. The mountains are quiet. Morning mist drifts slowly through the valleys. From a distance, smoke rises from scattered cabins nestled against the hillsides. It looks peaceful, almost timeless. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape lies a story stretching back nearly 2,000 years. The families living here are no longer thinking about Roman Britain. They are not thinking about the Scottish borders. Most have never seen Ulster. Many could not even point to Scotland on a map. Yet every surname they carry has quietly preserved that journey, a journey hidden inside a single family name, and no surname illustrates that better than the next one on our list, McCoy. Today, nearly everyone recognizes the name because of one famous chapter in American history, the Hatfield and McCoy feud. Books have been written about it. Films have dramatized it. Generations have remembered it as the ultimate example of family rivalry. But that famous feud represents only the final page of a much longer story. Long before the McCoys became part of Appalachian legend, they belonged to the ancient Gaelic world. The surname is generally derived from Mac Ioda, meaning son of Aod. Aod was an ancient Gaelic personal name associated with fire and appears throughout early Irish history. Over centuries, branches of the family established themselves in Ireland and western Scotland, before many later settled in Ulster. Imagine our traveling family once more. This time, they are no longer border riders. They are farmers in Ulster. Their children have grown. One son marries into a McCoy family, another into a Graham household. Within only a few generations, bloodlines that historians often discuss separately have become one extended family. That is exactly how history usually works. Communities do not remain isolated forever. They become connected. When later generations crossed the Atlantic, they carried far more than one surname. They carried centuries of intertwined ancestry. That is why genealogy so often surprises people. The farther back we travel, the more connected families become. Perhaps no surname better represents medieval Scotland than the next. Douglas. Few noble houses shaped Scotland more profoundly than the House of Douglas. During the Middle Ages, the Douglases became one of the kingdom's most powerful dynasties. Their castles dominated strategic regions. Their alliances determined wars. Their influence occasionally rivaled that of Scottish kings themselves. Yet history has a habit of humbling even the greatest families. Not every Douglas lived inside castles. Most became ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, ministers. Over generations, Douglas descendants joined the same migrations, transforming Scotland, Ulster, and eventually America. By the time they reached Appalachia, they were no longer famous nobles. They were frontier settlers, building cabins, clearing forests, raising families. Their greatest legacy was no longer political power. It was perseverance. And perhaps that is the hidden lesson behind the Douglas surname. History remembers great families because of castles. Genealogy remembers them because ordinary descendants survived. Now comes another surname whose quiet story often escapes attention: Blair. The name comes from the Gaelic word blar, usually referring to a plain or open field. Its strongest historical associations lie within Scotland, especially Perthshire and Ayrshire. Unlike some famous clan names, Blair rarely dominates popular history books, yet that makes it especially interesting. Thousands of Blair families quietly followed the same migration routes as their neighbors: Scotland, Ulster, Pennsylvania, the Great Wagon Road, Appalachia. No dramatic battles, no famous feuds, simply generation after generation adapting to wherever opportunity appeared. Sometimes the most remarkable history belongs to families whose names appear only briefly inside official records. Our next surname reminds us why genealogists must always remain cautious. Moore. At first glance, it seems simple. It is one of the most common surnames in the English-speaking world. Yet behind that apparent simplicity lies extraordinary complexity. Different Moore families emerged independently. Some possess Irish Gaelic origins, others English, others Scottish. Still others developed through Norman influence or descriptive medieval nicknames. Two Moore families living side by side in Appalachia might share almost nothing beyond their surname. One may descend largely from Ulster Scots settlers, another from English colonial families, a third from Irish ancestors who followed an entirely different migration route. The surname opens the investigation, it never finishes it. And that is exactly why genealogy remains so fascinating. Every answer produces another question. Every discovery opens another chapter. The next surname carried extraordinary prestige long before America even existed: Hamilton. The Hamiltons rose to become one of Scotland's greatest noble houses. Royal marriages, military leadership, political influence. For centuries, their name stood near the center of Scottish power. But, as with so many aristocratic surnames, time changed everything. The Hamiltons who eventually reached Appalachia were rarely powerful nobles. They were families seeking land, opportunity, security. Their descendants became teachers, millers, farmers, blacksmiths, community leaders. The title remained impressive. The lives became ordinary, and ordinary families built Appalachia. Our 14th surname quietly corrects one of the biggest misconceptions about Scots-Irish ancestry. Crawford. When people picture Scottish ancestors, they often imagine Highland warriors wearing tartan beneath towering mountains. Reality is often different. Many Appalachian families trace their roots instead to the Scottish lowlands and the border country. The Crawfords are one such example. An ancient lowland surname associated with Lanarkshire, Crawford reminds us that much of the Scots-Irish migration came not from the romantic Highlands, but from communities shaped by farming, trade, frontier life, and centuries of political change. That distinction matters, because understanding where families actually lived helps explain why they later adapted so successfully to frontier America. Then comes our final surname, one deeply rooted in Gaelic tradition, McKinney. Derived from Mac-Tionoda, the name reflects ancient Gaelic naming customs preserved across generations. Many McKinney families became firmly established in Ulster before crossing the Atlantic. Their journey mirrors that of thousands of neighboring families. Scotland, Ulster, Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains. Different surname, remarkably familiar story. And now, after following 15 surnames across nearly 2,000 years, the greatest surprise finally becomes clear. There was never one single Scottish story. There was never one single Irish story. There was never one single Appalachian story. Instead, there were countless journeys. Some families began among Gaelic-speaking Highland communities, others in the Scottish lowlands, others beside the turbulent Anglo-Scottish border. Some spent centuries in Ulster, others reached America through different routes entirely. Modern DNA continues revealing exactly what historians increasingly suspected. The peoples of Britain and Ireland were already the product of repeated migration long before their descendants crossed the Atlantic. Ancient Britons, Gaels, Picts, Romans, Norse settlers, Anglo-Saxon neighbors, Norman influence, generation after generation, each added another thread to an already remarkable tapestry. That discovery does not weaken Scottish identity, nor Irish identity. It strengthens both, because it reminds us that history is not about purity. It is about continuity. It is about ordinary people surviving extraordinary change, and nowhere is that story told more beautifully than in Appalachia. But there remains one final chapter, perhaps the most emotional of them all, because after 2,000 years of migration, after kingdoms rose and fell, after families crossed seas and oceans, one question still remains: what does all of this mean? For you, that answer awaits in our final chapter. Now, stand once more upon a quiet Appalachian hillside. The sun is beginning to disappear behind the mountains. A weathered white church stands beside an old cemetery. Rows of worn headstones stretch across the hillside. Campbell, Armstrong, Graham, Buchanan, Stewart, McCoy, Douglas, Hamilton, Blair, Moore, Ferguson, Maxwell, Morrison, Crawford, McKinney. To most visitors, they are simply names carved into stone. But now you know better. Each one is a chapter. Each one is the final destination of a journey that began centuries before America even existed. Our imaginary family has finally reached the end of its journey. The young couple who boarded a ship in Belfast, the grandparents who once survived the Scottish border, the children born in Ulster, the grandchildren who crossed the Atlantic, the great-grandchildren who walked the Great Wagon Road. Generation after generation, they kept moving toward an unknown future, not because they wanted adventure, because history demanded it. Every frontier they left behind prepared them for the next one. The Scottish borders taught them resilience. Ulster taught them adaptation. The Atlantic taught them endurance. Appalachia gave them a place to finally call home. Their story is fictional, but the journey is profoundly real. Hundreds of thousands of families experienced versions of that same remarkable migration. Perhaps your ancestors were among them. Perhaps they carried one of the surnames we've explored today. Or perhaps they carried another name entirely, because the truth is, the 15 surnames in this documentary are only 15 windows into a much larger story. Thousands of Appalachian families share remarkably similar histories. Some surnames disappeared. Others changed their spelling. Some were shortened after arriving in America. Others became Americanized over generations. Mac became Mac Stewart, became Stewart in some branches. Campbells married Grahams. Armstrongs married Fergusons. Irish families married Scottish families. Neighbors became relatives. Within only a few generations, the lines separating one ancestry from another began fading. That is exactly what modern genealogy continues revealing. Family history is not a collection of isolated branches. It is an enormous forest whose roots constantly intertwine beneath the surface. And now, DNA has given us another remarkable way of seeing those hidden roots. Many people hope a DNA test will provide one simple answer. I'm Scottish. I'm Irish. I'm English. I'm Norwegian. History rarely works that way. Instead, DNA often reveals something far richer. A family that proudly identified as Scottish for 300 years may discover Irish ancestry from Ulster. A family that always believed it was Irish may uncover deep roots in the Scottish borders. Others discover Scandinavian ancestry inherited from Viking settlements established more than 1,000 years ago. Some even find genetic connections reaching back toward the ancient peoples who lived in Britain before the Roman conquest. None of these discoveries erase family traditions. They deepen them. They remind us that identity is built across generations, not in a single moment. This is perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside Appalachian surnames. A surname is a clue, not a conclusion. It points toward a language, a landscape, a migration, a community. But only careful genealogy, historical records, and sometimes DNA can reveal the remarkable journey that followed. That is why historians continue reminding us that surnames should never be treated as proof of ancestry. They are starting points, not finishing lines. And yet, even without perfect certainty, these names remain extraordinary because they connect ordinary people to some of history's greatest migrations: ancient Britain, Roman Britain, the rise of medieval Scotland, the Viking Age, the Border Reivers, the Plantation of Ulster, the Atlantic crossings, the Great Wagon Road, the settlement of Appalachia. Few places on earth contain so much history inside so many ordinary family names. Perhaps that is why genealogy has become one of the fastest growing hobbies in the world. People are not simply searching for names. They are searching for themselves, searching for forgotten grandparents, searching for villages no longer visited, searching for churches where ancestors worshipped, searching for the reasons why one family left Scotland while another left Ireland, and why both eventually met inside the mountains of America. Sometimes the answers are joyful, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes surprising, but almost always they are more fascinating than the legends we inherited. Because real history is rarely simple, it is wonderfully human. As we've traveled together across nearly 2,000 years, one truth has appeared again and again. History is not made only by kings, or queens, or famous generals. History is made by ordinary families, families who packed everything they owned into a wagon, families who crossed dangerous seas, families who buried loved ones far from the places where they were born, families who started over again and again, until eventually their descendants became the people we now call Appalachians. Perhaps you see your own surname differently now. Perhaps you feel inspired to begin tracing your own family tree. If so, start with the stories your oldest relatives still remember. Search old photographs, read family Bibles, visit local cemeteries, explore census records, passenger lists, church registers, military files, land deeds, and if you choose to take a DNA test, treat it as one more piece of evidence rather than the final answer. Because genealogy is not about replacing family stories. It is about enriching them. If you have enjoyed this journey through the hidden history of Appalachian surnames, Scots-Irish migration, and the remarkable families who helped shape America, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to UK Bloodlines, and turn on notifications. Every week, we uncover forgotten histories, remarkable migrations, and the hidden stories preserved inside the names millions of people still carry today. And now we'd love to hear from you. Is your surname one of the 15 we explored? Did your family come from Appalachia? Have you uncovered Scottish, Irish, or Ulster roots through genealogy or DNA? Or perhaps your surname deserves its own documentary. Tell us your family's story in the comments below. Many of our future documentaries begin with the stories you share. Until next time, remember this: a surname is never just a word. It is an inheritance, a passport through history, a bridge between continents, a whisper from ancestors whose voices have long since faded, but whose journeys still live on in every generation that follows. And somewhere, hidden inside your own family name, may be one of the greatest stories never told.